Hello, Daphne here with an interesting video for you. At least I think it's interesting. The title is The Incredible Technology Advancement of Commercial Airline Flights. And this world traveler's first takeoff and subsequent flights. Over the years, having flown over 3 million miles worldwide, I thought it would be interesting to take a look back on the incredible advancement in flight technology in my lifetime. I was not born when the first commercial flight took place, which was a short flight from Tampa to St. Petersburg on the airboat line. It took exactly 23 minutes, and that was on January 1st, 1914. Okay, so my very first flight was on a luxury Boeing 377 Stratocruiser from San Francisco International Airport to New York City. The year was 1949, and tragically my father had just died. My mother was moving us back to New York from the East Coast, to the East Coast from San Francisco, because that was where her family was from. The plane was luxurious. We dressed up in those days, so my twin sister and I had on beautiful dresses and patent leather Mary Jane shoes for our very, very first flight ever. And were we ever excited? We were probably a little apprehensive too, but I remember boarding that flight and waving goodbye to friends on the ground and wondering what it was like to fly. The flight took over 11 hours from beginning to end. This is an actual picture of the flight we were on, taken by a dear friend of our family's. My mother had moved back east, leaving us with our grandmother in California. But my twin sister and I knew that when we got on this flight, it would probably be our last time to be in California for quite some time, and it was. We were to open presents every single hour given to us by the family friend who thought that might be a great way to have two little girls on their first flight, a little apprehensive. It would maybe make the flight more fun and feel like a shorter period of time. We also flew this same exact prop plane to Haiti, when my adoptive father was charge d'affaires there in the late 1950s. Back in those days, airline flights were something special. People got dressed up. The flight attendants were absolutely into making sure that you were comfortable and well fed on every flight. It was a glamorous time in airline flight. They served full meals on real china, and the airline seats were large and comfortable, lots of legroom, and of course, passengers always looked nice. No tank tops allowed. My very first transatlantic flight was from Idlewild Airport in New York, Kennedy Airport, better known as Idlewild back then. I flew in 1963 nonstop to Brussels, Belgium. That was a memorable trip because I saw Nastya, my Russian nanny, and also the Russian nanny that was my mother's when she was young. This was such a touching reunion. When I left, I knew that I would never see my precious Nastya ever again, and I did not. As a side note, I remember a trip when my twin sister and I snuck a dog on the plane. This was a transatlantic flight from Glasgow, Scotland to Idlewild Airport in New York. We brought along an abandoned puppy, a gift from a friend of ours in Ireland. Didn't make a peep the whole time. When we touched down in New York, we even made it through customs with our four-legged friend without a moment's worry. But those were absolutely wonderful flights on 707s. And in those days, I think that flight from Glasgow to New York took like 16 hours. And I do remember that flight being a scary one. It was bumpy, bumpy, bumpy over the Atlantic. But how I love flying. But there was a time in my life when I was afraid of flying, and that was after I got married and my children were born. For some reason, I was afraid something would happen to me and that there would be nobody left to really love and take care of my children. And this was broadcast in full view on a trip my husband and I took on a French Caravelle jet from London to Paris in the late 60s. The Caravelle jets, as you can see in this picture, have engines in the back of the plane, and we, of course, were in coach towards the back. I was sitting in the middle seat, my husband was sitting on the aisle, and a Vietnam veteran pilot was sitting on the right. After the plane took off, it seemed like we were still at a very low altitude when I heard what I thought was the engines being turned off. I dug my fingernails into my husband's leg and the unsuspecting Vietnam pilot next to me and held on for dear life. The pilot looked at me with the most caring look on his face and said, "Lady, this plane is the safest in the world. Those pilots, if you knew what I had on my jet or prop plane or whatever he was flying in Vietnam, if you knew how few controls we had compared to this plane, you wouldn't be scared one bit." So at that moment, I removed my fingernails from their legs and enjoyed the rest of the flight. Of course, you all know the next major advancement in flight was not everyday passengers like me in the mid and late 60s, but it was an extraordinary flight of 240 miles plus in 1969 when Neil Armstrong's capsule landed on the moon after that 240,000-mile flight from Mother Earth and became the first person to ever step foot on the moon. Now that was the real definition of flight, if you ask me. But back to planet Earth and another flight for me, which was unfortunately not to be. But how I loved the Concorde jet, a gorgeous looking plane in my opinion. It made its maiden voyage on March 2nd, 1969, from New York to London, a distance of 1,354 miles. It flew at 1,354 miles per hour at Mach 2.04, twice the speed of sound. Wow, what a thrill that must have been to fly on the Concorde. In 1982, I had a chance to fly the Concorde to London on a long-planned business trip. The reservations were made, seat assignments given out, but to my total dismay, several days before this business meeting in London was to take place, our trip was canceled. As you can imagine, I was heartbroken, and I never got a chance again to fly on a Concorde. During my business career in the 80s in New York City, I can't tell you how many flights between New York and San Francisco and New York and Los Angeles on McDonnell Douglas's DC-10s, an American Airlines wide-body plane. These American Airlines flights were just so comfortable. This was a absolutely wonderful plane, and luckily for me, my employer flew us first class on those transcontinental flights. But there were a lot of safety concerns about the DC-10. There were crashes and incidents, and my friends and family said, "Oh, please do not fly on DC-10s anymore." But American's flight schedule was perfect for me, so I continued on those DC-10s, and I'm here today to tell you about all my hours in the air. The 747 is the world's longest currently operating passenger airline. I remember my first flight on a jumbo jet in first class on a business trip. It was to Europe. My seat was in the upper level. Wow, was that an exciting place to be on a 747. Oh, I was in seventh heaven, to put it mildly. The seats were comfortable. The service was excellent. The plane was an absolute wonder, a gigantic plane. I can't remember how many people it were on it, but it was packed. And unfortunately, many years later, I took a flight from Kennedy Airport to London Heathrow on a 747, and it was such a disappointment. The interior was all shabby and raggedy. It was old and worn out. And so the joy and glamour of flying a 747 was then immediately gone from me, which was too bad. So in a couple of years, there'll be the 777X, the new Boeing plane, the largest and most efficient twin-engine jet ever built. The interior is designed with all the creature comforts, and it will hold more than 400 people. It's not in service now, but it's scheduled for certification in the fourth quarter of 2023. So that is one gal's life history of flight. How amazing to have experienced aircraft advancement over so many years. Wonder what planes will be capable of doing 100 years from now. Of course, I won't be able to answer that question, but one thing is for sure, it will continue to be an awesome way to travel all over planet Earth.